Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the LitheSpeed webinar series. My name is Stephanie. I'll be around for the duration of the webinar if you guys have any questions. That way we can just facilitate those. We do expect that the webinar is going to take the entire hour, so we'll be taking those questions at the end. However, if you'd like to ask anything throughout the entire presentation, feel free to just go ahead and submit those questions. All you have to do is go to the questions box to the right-hand side of your screen and click on that button to type. Our host today is Mr. Sanjiv Augustine, who's going to tell us the 5 steps to disruptive innovation. And I think we're all ready to get this webinar going, so I will turn it over to the expert. Thanks, Sanjiv.
Thank you, Stephanie, and welcome to all of you out there in internet land. My name is Sanjiv Augustine. A few points about my bio. I'm the co-founder of both this consulting, training, and product development company called LitheSpeed. It is our 10th anniversary year, so we're pretty happy about that. And then most recently, in the last couple of years, we've also co-founded along with Arlen Bankston, something called the Agile Leadership Academy, which is in the business of preparing leaders to take and lead and transform not only themselves, but their enterprises with Agile and Lean methods. Along the journey, I've written a couple books, the first one being Managing Agile Projects. You can see it at the bottom left-hand side of your screen, and that was all around learning how to get Agile projects, Agile teams in place. Several years later, as Agile methods matured, so did we, and then we had to figure out along the way how to scale Agile. And then I'm hoping to work on a third book next year, and this one's going to be about using Agile and Lean to transform and disrupt our enterprises. And therefore, this webinar will pull together some of those thoughts. Our agenda for today is going to be, let's define this term, disruptive innovation. It's been around for quite a while. Some of you might be familiar with Clayton Christensen from Harvard Business School. He's got, he coined the term a couple of decades ago, and there's a bunch of material out there. We're going to be looking at the concepts that Christensen presents and then using or applying those concepts within our context, which is Agile projects and Agile programs and Agile organizations. And as such, what I'm going to offer to you are 5 steps. You see them here: standing teams, engineering, product discovery, budgeting and funding, innovation pipeline management, which is sort of a higher level concept that we absolutely need to get into. And then, as Stephanie mentioned, we have the Q&A time at the end. All right. I do also want to figure out, where you all are from. So I'm sitting in my home office in the Washington D.C. area, to be precise, in the Northern Virginia area, and also thinking about all the stuff that's going on in the world with the, sending out our thoughts and prayers to our brothers and sisters in Mexico, as well as in the Caribbean and all the places where there's a little suffering out there. So I want to sort of just quickly get a sense of where you all are from. So if you, okay. So Stephanie, we have an issue with there we go. We're testing out a new polling software, so I think you should be able to respond and tell us where you're from. There is a text facility. You can text LitheSpeed L933, or you can respond at pollev.com. So if you could sort of quickly tell us where you're from, and we'll test out this little polling software. It should give us the responses quite a bit, or immediately, quite quickly. So give it a second. Richmond, I assume that's Richmond, Virginia, which is about 100 miles south of us here. Fantastic. Atlanta, Georgia. Ashburn, Virginia, also, I guess, in the DC. Okay, somebody close to home here. International. Tampa, you guys probably recovering from the hurricane. Bethesda, Florida. Malvern, Pennsylvania, I guess. Wow, this is moving quick. Houston, all right. Also some friends out there. Hope you guys are safe and recovering. Pamplico, not sure where that is. All right, no international friends. So this is very interesting, and we'll sort of keep an eye on this. But thank you all for joining. And Netherlands. Well, there you go. Some of our first international friends. Thanks for joining over here. Okay, so I am going to move on. We have somebody from Omaha, Nebraska. All right, fantastic. Let us now look to this concept of disruptive innovation and put in a quick definition. Um, you guys have told us where you're from. I didn't exactly ask you what generation you belong to, whether you're a baby boomer, a Gen X, or Gen Y, or a millennial. But whatever generation you are, some of us might remember some of the older cameras, and you might be familiar with the Polaroid and Kodak and those instant cameras where you take around, and it was pretty dramatic in those days. That I remember being super excited about being able to take a picture and then get the printout, get the sort of hard copy of the picture right away instead of having to send it off to some lab somewhere. And for a number of decades, this was the prevailing technology. This was the norm in the camera industry. And you can see all of a sudden there was some massive disruption with digital cameras, right? And you look at the stock ticker over there at the bottom of the screen, and you see for several decades, both Polaroid and Kodak ruled the roost. But then from the 1990s, there was a steep fall off, and our digital revolution took off. And there you see an example of a technology that has come in and toppled some of the market players. It's a stark and important critical reminder that we live in an age of creative destruction, that term from Schumpeter, management theorist over there. But what we see is that in the last decade or so, it is clearly accelerating. And you see here a chart that lays out the average lifespan on the S&P, the Standard & Poor's Financial Index. About, in the 1960s, a few decades ago, it turns out that the average lifespan of a company, the time that a company could stay on the S&P index, was about 60 years. And it's been steadily decreasing. You can see that a trend, even though there's partial or temporary increases, you can see that the general trend is decreasing to the point that round about here, 2017, we're looking at about 15 years or so, and then in the next 10 or 15 years, it's going to go down to about 12 or 15 years, which means that the churn that we've seen on the S&P and other indexes or indices, with here in the U.S., companies like Amazon.com and Whole Foods, which incidentally just got bought out by Amazon.com, Netflix, they have replaced some of the more traditional brands that have exited the index, and now you can see that companies like Sears and Wendy's and all that are actually struggling to stay alive. So there is a definite incentive for those of us who are in today's industry and leaders in some of our in organizations to keep an eye on this and do what we can from within our agile teams and our organizations to help our companies stay competitive. So I want to lay out these 5 steps, and also just remind everybody that when we are able to get on top of disruption and then maybe perhaps even disrupt ourselves, we can emulate some of the well-known disruptors in the market. So this graph over here, kind of a nice hockey stick graph, is Airbnb. Many of us might be familiar with Airbnb. I know when my family vacations now, we always stay at Airbnb. We get a larger set of premises and for usually a cheaper price. And so a lot of our family vacations are now staying in Airbnb properties. What's amazing is that even 5 years ago, bottom right, you can see that in 2002, there was a room booked every 2 seconds. So there's a huge acceleration. I'm not even sure what the current figures are, but you know that trend is only accelerated, if anything. So anybody in the hospitality industry, whether it's a Marriott or a Sheraton or Holiday Inn, I'm sure they're looking at this and trying to figure out ways to competitively go up against Airbnb. Right? So disruptive innovation can happen to anyone, and what I want to do now is to play a video from Harvard Business School where they're going to be talking about disruptive innovation, and there might be a bit of a lag over here, so I apologize for that. But let me switch to this video. Yeah, here we go. QuickTime Player. And let's watch our video.
How does a small, young company beat an industry giant on its own turf? Through what Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen calls disruptive innovation. It works like this. Big players focus on sustaining innovation, upgrading existing products and services to attract higher-paying customers. But soon, they start to ignore all the regular customers who just want simple, low-cost alternatives. That's where the entrepreneurial company jumps in, with that basic offering. The big guys stay focused on more profitable customers and begin to overserve, adding bells and whistles no one wants to pay for. Meanwhile, the disruptor improves its product to appeal to more people. By the time the incumbent notices, the disruptor has already started to take over the market. The classic example is the steel mini mills, which first produced low-quality rebar, then moved to sheet steel, stealing business from the large mills that had been dominant. More recent disruptors include car makers like Toyota and Hyundai, which launched with economy models, then added luxury features and brands. The only way for industry giants to fight back is by launching their own disruptive innovations. To succeed, they must treat the project as a separate unit with a different business model and growth expectations. Ask, what job do customers need to get done? Segment customers by job, not by product, market size, or demographics. And develop basic, low-cost ways to get the job done. That's how Procter & Gamble came up with Crest White Strips, a cheap, do-it-yourself alternative to an expensive dental service. Disruptive innovation creates new markets and reshapes existing ones. To achieve growth in a fast-changing world, you want to be a disruptor. Don't be disrupted.
Okay, so let's jump back over here into our presentation, having watched that baseline video on the concept of disruptive innovation, and let's start to talk about our 5 steps to disruptive innovation. I do also want to do another quick poll, and here I want to ask you the question before I go into presenting some of the concepts of building on Agile for disruptive innovation. Please tell us, if you would, using the polling website or the text, what your level of Agile is. And so we start to see that some of you are intermediate level. Hopefully, yeah, we got some novices. And the answers to this particular question will help me fine-tune or adjust my coverage and presentation of the slides that are coming up. So thank you very much. We got a few folks who are advanced. Most folks are intermediate. All right, fantastic. So jumping up and down. We'll give it another minute or so. But looks like most of you are sort of solidly in the middle of the road, and looks like the advanced folks are chipping in now. All right, looks like we're getting sort of an even split between novice, intermediate, and advanced folks. All right, let's move forward with that set of data, and that'll tell me that I have to introduce some of the concepts in a little more, more basic form, and maybe help look to our advanced folks to stay awake and not too bored. All right, so let's start off with talking about the first building block over here for disruptive innovation, and that's this concept of a high-performance standing team. Now, for the novices out there, Scrum is the leading Agile method. We have, of course, the set of Agile methods that includes XP, Kanban, XP or Extreme Programming, Kanban, and Scrum, and some others, and the team-based, and these are called team-based Agile methods. We have a newer set of methods called Scaled Agile, the Scaled Agile Framework, or SAFe, large-scale Scrum or less, and then Disciplined Agile Delivery. Those are the program and portfolio levels. But if you look at the very basic building block of Agile methods, they always are the team, right? So we start with a team, and in Scrum, our team is supposed to be multidisciplinary. It's supposed to be composed of a mix of folks, and somewhere between 3 to 9 people is supposed to be our sweet spot, right? And most companies, I would say, that have started with Agile methods have been able to achieve this. That is, they've been able to set up teams, they've been able to set up Agile teams, maybe even get cross-functional teams or multidisciplinary teams. But if you look at these teams, if you sort of zoom out and look at the teams in the larger context of the organization, it probably ends up looking like this slide over here, that these Agile teams are within a development silo. You might actually have a test and QA, which is in it's a different silo, and then operational and business, also another sub-silo under IT, and then our business partners might be in a totally different silo. So what we have represented here, and this is for the advanced folks, is merely a representation of Conway's rule. Conway's rule says that whatever process we have, our organizations will mirror that, right? So if we have a waterfall process, then we end up with all of these siloed organizations. So it's great to start off with Agile teams. What our next step is to build out these Agile teams and start to negate or remove or reduce or eliminate the effects of Conway's rule on our organizations. Put another way for the novices, it's simply to start to smash these silos and get our teams moving end to end. So what we want is a shift left to the business side and a shift right to infrastructure and operations, so that we can have end-to-end teams. So what we're talking about now, and I move to the next slide, is teams that will stay together. That's why we call them standing teams. Now, some of you might be familiar, if you come from a background of traditional project management, you might be familiar with the concept of the Tuckman model of team formation. Now, you'll probably recognize it more easily if I gave you the phrase forming, storming, norming, and performing. And that's been around for at least 2 or 3 decades. That concept is that we know that when we put a team together, they have to go through this change management cycle of having to form, having to storm, work out their kinks, get personalities sort of sorted out, and then they move into norming, where they can start to get into some sort of a groove, and then and only then can they move into a high performance state. So if we want a high performance team, what we want to do necessarily is to keep that team together, whether it's for a project, whether if you have a project-based organization, or for a product, which is for a longer period of time. So our goal is to bring teams together and keep them together so that we don't have to go through that Tuckman team formation model over and over again. Because what might not be immediately obvious is that every time we add somebody or we take somebody out of the team or add somebody in, then we go back to the beginning of that team formation cycle, right? The other thing that we can do if we have a standing team is that rather than taking people and bringing them onto projects and assigning them to projects, the team itself can stay standing or more in a permanent kind of status. And then what we can do is we can start to queue up our projects, and we can maybe even move away completely from the project model to a product model, and then line up releases instead of projects and bring them to the team at a time. So that's what you see in this diagram on the right-hand side. We can also very easily extend, once we've done this project or the standing team model for within IT, we can start to shift it left. By that I mean we can extend our teams in Agile teams to the business side. Now, this requires a little rethinking and a little bit of organizational design over here. So what you see in front of you is a model that we've implemented in some of our cutting edge, if you will, enterprise Agile clients. And you see some examples of business functions: seamless delivery, effortless point of sale, flexible viewing channels. These are all things that are what we would call a customer experience. With digital transformations, what our leading companies are looking at doing are to reorient the organization to focus on the customer journey or the customer experience. So we sit down and we start to look at our end customers, we look at how they interact with us and look at these business functions. What we want to do then is to orient our entire teams to service these customers end to end. So what we can do, if you take these examples over here, we can put a product manager. So this would be one level above the product owner, and we can put product managers in charge of what so-called customer experience value stream. And then at that time, we can build a team around that. Now, this could be one team, it could be multiple teams, but what we know then is that we can use our Agile teams as a building block to create these customer experience value stream teams, if you will. I also want to talk about the model you see there, those sort of not concentric, but interlinked circles: discover, refine, deliver. I'm going to come back to that. But note on the right-hand side of each one of these customer experience team, it says digital measurement, and that is the engineering side of that, and I'm going to talk about that next. So when we have multiple teams like this, when we have multiple customer experience teams, we can start to see them as part of a larger ecosystem. I mentioned earlier that we can line up projects as far as releases, within products as part of a larger portfolio. So whether we're using just straight Scrum or using Scrum and XP within a larger scaled agile safe framework, or any other method like the DAD or the LESS framework, what we can start to do is say, all right, we have customer experience teams. Each one of these are multidisciplinary. We've shifted some of the functions to the left so that they can focus on the customers, they can research user needs, translate the vision into stories, build and design prototypes, and also get into the delivery side. There is a legend on the top right. I'm not going to call that out. These slides will be available to you guys afterwards, so you can look and sort of examine and review the slide. By the way, the credit for this work goes to a gentleman by the name of David Blair. He's at the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, and this is the model that they use on a $2 billion program with standing teams, and the portfolio of work sort of routed to these standing teams. Okay, so that wraps up our discussion on standing teams. And what I want to do is to sort of jump straight into the discussion on high-performance agile engineering. So whether we start with Scrum or Kanban or XP at the team level, any of these methods are necessary, but they're not sufficient. If you're building products, if you're doing applications, or even if you're in just maintenance and operations, we have to leverage or build upon our teams with their process-oriented practices from Scrum, maybe a daily stand-up and a cross-functional team, and extend those very quickly into the engineering side. Otherwise, we're not going to get the type of results that our business partners and our management and our customers are looking for. So with that, what we want to do, what we want to do is to draw inspiration from lean thinking. And some of you might be familiar with lean thinking. Comes, the Toyota production system became known as in the West as lean, and within TPS or lean, we have this concept of Judoka. And it is essentially automation with a human touch, where Toyota was able to say, when we have repetitive tasks and that are very error prone, and we have human beings doing those tasks, we should look for a way to automate those and automate them with a so-called human touch, so that we always have the personal angle to it. But what we want to do now is to start to look at the things that happen regularly within our agile teams on the technology side of things, and start to automate those with what we call DevOps. Many of you might be familiar with this new buzzword. I think it's called DevOps. It's meant to be sort of the concatenation of development and ops, but I think that's an oversimplification. So what I want to do is to just lay out 3 principles over here for DevOps, and talk a little bit about how we can apply those to build high-performance engineering into our high-performance agile teams. All right, so first thing we have to do is to make sure that we can develop and test as close to production as possible. Many of us who have been around for some time have remembered the days where integration test was usually all manual. It would take weeks, and sometimes on large programs, even months, to get any sort of integration test together. Luckily, now we're moving to getting these done almost continuously. Okay? Once we can integrate and test rapidly, what we also want to do is to deploy frequently. And this is, again, a repetitive task that tends to be pretty difficult. If something's difficult on the technology side, then what we want to do is to just attack it repeatedly, so that we can find ways to make it repeatable and easier. And then once we deploy our code into production, we want to make sure that we can continuously validate operation quality and get some sort of digital measurement. I mentioned up front that in our standing teams diagram, in the customer experience teams diagram, digital measurement, and this is what we need to put in place. All right, so let's look at the first thing we want to do is, if you look at this slide, it's going to show you the end-to-end progression. But the first thing that we should do is to move towards what's known as CI. You probably have heard of these acronyms. There's a kind of a buzzword now, CI and CD. These are continuous integration and continuous delivery. First thing we want to do is to get our handle on continuous integration. And even before we can do continuous integration, the absolute ground zero type thing to start is automated build and test. That is, we should be able to extract all of our code from our code bases, compile them, link them, and run any automated test. And so that's called an automated build and test. So you look at the enabler box down there, and it's going to list all of these things: automated builds, automated unit tests, automated functional tests, and frequent commits. There are some technologies behind these that I don't want to go in over here, but again, the chart is available to you. Once we have automated build and test, then we can say, okay, let's try to do automated build and test on a regular or a continuous basis, and that becomes continuous integration. And then once we have continuous integration, our next step is building block is to be able to do continuous delivery, deliver to production as rapidly and as seamlessly and as possible. And then once something is in production, then we're going to be looking at release and post-release validation with our digital measurement. So this is our CI/CD pipeline, if you will, and also on top of that, making sure that we can get feedback. Once we have all of these things in place, then we have high-performance engineering, agile engineering, and from a measurement perspective, this is what we can do. We can close the loop from customer success to business success. You see here a progression, and at a management view or at a macro view, this is what we're trying to achieve. We want to kind of link to make sure that when our products are being released to our customers rapidly, and we are able to monitor and learn from any sort of issues along the way, we can put in sort of touch points and measurements at each stage of that value stream. So we can start, for example, on the left-hand side with average revenue per user, looking at a business success, looking at the development, QA, deployment, release, operational, and then to customer success. And here you see a link which is not meant to be one way, but again a loop to close out from customer to business success and continuously measure this in a digital way. When we're able to do this regularly, then we get results like our sort of superstars over here with Amazon, where they are able to do deployments every few seconds. So you look at these kind of stunning figures. This is from the State of DevOps report, I believe, and that Puppet puts out, and they have 30,000 maximum hosts, 10,000 mean hosts receiving deployments simultaneously. And then what's stunning is that what used to take several weeks or at least several days, a few years ago, is now being done every few seconds. Right? So in essence, let's put our standing teams together. Let's supercharge our standing teams with agile engineering practices and tools and the whole continuous integration, continuous deployment, and release and post-release monitoring with the agile engineering. And then we can move to our third step. And then so our third step is now to look at more to the shift left into the business side. So with Scrum, we have a product owner, and a product owner works on a backlog and prioritizes it. But we don't necessarily validate the backlog as often as we should with end users and end customers. So that sort of drives us into this concept of using the lean startup cycle, or more specifically within lean startup, it's for those of you who might be familiar with it, the build, measure, learn cycle on the business side. So if I put if I can put a backlog together, or even before I put a backlog together, I want to be looking at our customers. I want to be looking at their journeys those customers are taking, and now make sure that I build my products to customer fit. That'll allow me to adapt. That'll allow me to understand what the changing needs, and then disrupt my business or my competitors' businesses as necessary. So we have here an overlay of this concept called Lean Startup from Eric Ries, and Eric Ries working with Steve Blank in the Silicon Valley, basically said, know your customer, start small, fail fast, take small ideas and do them rapidly, release them to production. And then again, if you have agile engineering, agile teams, we can do this, right? Because we have those platforms on which to fail fast, and test relentlessly. But perhaps the most important bullet on this slide is the one that is last. It says, seek customer validation at all levels. And I want to interject a personal note over here in that, yes, seeking validation is important, but sometimes seeking invalidation is even more important. And let me spend a minute talking about that concept. What we want to do is that we want to set up some sort of progression over here. And you see that on this slide, where we have ideas coming in, and there should be a flow, of course, in this from the left-hand side of the screen to the right-hand side. We might have some ideas coming in, and we need to validate those ideas. In the lean startup phase over there is something called customer discovery or customer development. But as these ideas are invalidated, we need to get rid of them. And getting rid of them just removes the junk in our cycle as quickly as possible and allows us to focus on the things that are actually necessary. So what we need to do is to go out to our customers, talk to them, or observe them. The UX term over here is called ethnographic observation. Observe them in their natural habitats, if you will. Look at them, look at what their challenges are, look at how they work, and then validate or invalidate our ideas. Once we've done that, then we can start to move to some sort of design thinking, building out our products, maybe with some mock-ups, with wireframes. Again, making sure that we can validate at every level, right? So here, this is once we've gone beyond the idea validation, now what we want to do is to test our prototypes, test our design concepts, and validate or invalidate those using design thinking. And then and only then should we move into our agile, more familiar agile territory with epics and features and stories. And of course, as we find stories that need to be validated or invalidated, if it's validated, then and only then should we start building it. And if it's invalidated, we send them to the trash can. So this is a little more complex than the familiar idea of having a product backlog and just having a product owner prioritize that backlog. What it does is that ensures that we have the tie-in to end users, stakeholders, and other customers, and then that we're constantly seeking validation at all levels. When we do this in a larger enterprise, it tends to be a little more complex. So in a smaller startup, Eric Ries and Steve Blank, when they work with startups, they can lay out a more simple model with the build, measure, learn. But if you're working within a larger organization, and many of our clients tend to be larger organizations, this is a model that you see that we've perfected over here. Well, I mean, there's nothing perfect, that we've refined, let's say, or evolved in working with them. And we've extended a build, measure, learn to discovery, refinement, and delivery. And this is, of course, meant to be a loop. It's not just moving left to right. But there's a particular cadence, and you see that discovery is quarterly, where we're doing big room planning or PI planning if you're doing product increment, program increment planning, excuse me, if you're doing SAFe. And then we're building out our stories, planning out our minimum viable products, coming up with the release plan, epics, and any other documents as needed. And we're doing those probably on a quarterly cycle or quarterly cadence. Once we have those higher level plans, then what we can do is to start to refine them, create UI prototypes or UX guidance, create a backlog, prioritize it, and that might be done on a monthly cycle. And then we can move into our Scrum teams over here to the right with delivery, and then continuous delivery as well, and then releasing as often as possible, or releasing on demand based on what the product owner tells us. So our discovery, refinement, and delivery model is essentially a way of taking the lean startup entrepreneur type model and applying it in a larger enterprise and an intrapreneur model. And when we do that, then we can end up with again some gold standards over here. Intuit has been able to take the lean startup model and internalize it. GE, General Electric, has also had spectacular results. But look at what Scott Cook, who's the founder of Intuit, look at what he says. They're able to get, at peak season, run 165 experiments in production. And the result is that they get a 50% conversion rate. And then, of course, from the team members, everybody loves it because their new ideas can make it to market. Clearly, not all the new ideas are making it to market. My sense is that many of those new ideas are being invalidated and being sort of chucked in the wastebasket, but of course with data and not at the whim of any the emotions of any one person, perhaps even not even the whim of Scott Cook, who's the president of the company. All right, so I'm going to take a pause here and move to the next slide and see if there are any questions. We have two more practices or building blocks to lay out, and that's agile budgeting and funding, and innovation pipeline management. And I want to take a quick look to see if there are any questions that have come up. Questions, all right.
I've got a couple of questions that have come in on my side.
Okay.
So starting with the beginning here, have you seen disruption, like in the first part of this presentation, in the Agile community?
Sure. In fact, I just got back from the Agile 2017 conference, and it was almost like a watch. You can see all of the announcements that are being made. So it started a couple of years ago when there's some of our friends at Big Visible were bought up. Some of you might remember the awesome company, Guillermo Moraine and George Slitz founded this awesome Agile consulting and coaching company, and they grew very rapidly and became successful. And then they were acquired by Solutions IQ, also a wonderful company out on the West Coast, and they had grown to and extended their reach to the East Coast. And at Agile 2017, there was a announcement made that Solutions IQ had been acquired by Accenture. And that's not just in the services space. There's a lot of it going on. But in the product space, many of us have watched where we started with Rally. Some of you might remember Rally, a great tool, now bought out by a larger company called CA. So the Rally Dev tool is now CA Agile Central. And then at Agile 2017, there was an announcement that version 1, which is one of Rally's competitors, had been bought out as well. So you see, and I think that one was with CollabNet, had acquired or partnered or something, some large merger. So not only is it, have I seen it, but it's accelerating. I've seen an acceleration in the last 6 months. We quite often get, at LitheSpeed, we quite often get requests from other larger companies to acquire us as well, but we like to stay ahead of the innovation cycle and are constantly in a mode of disrupting ourselves before we get disrupted by somebody else. Okay. All right. Great question. All right. I'm going to move on and finish these two sections, and then we'll have I'm sure some time for questions at the end. All right. So within IT, and then even when we extend out to our business partners, we are not usually able to crack this really tough problem that has to do with our budgeting cycles. Most organizations, especially the larger the organization, the longer the budgeting cycles. Most folks are stuck into some sort of annual budgeting cycle, and it locks us in. When we have an annual budgeting cycle, it locks us into a path. And then even if you have agile teams, and even if you have agile engineering, and even if you can do experimentation using the startup, we're sort of our hands are sort of tied with our budgeting cycle. So I'm going to play a short video over here from some friends in the Beyond Budgeting community, and they're going to tell us about how to keep flexible with our plans and forecasts.
Principle number 9, plans and forecasts. Making planning and forecasting lean and unbiased processes, not rigid political exercises. When you think about planning and forecasting, they're very different from target setting, principle number 8, and they deserve their own principle. All too often, organizations prepare annual budgets that include both targets and detailed plans for the coming year, as well as projections for income, cash flow, etc. When you put those two together, though, the activities are serving very, very different purposes. Targets should be ambitious, whereas plans and forecasts should be realistic.
the best guess given the circumstances and assumptions that you think is actually going to happen. This is one of the reasons why annual budgeting should be replaced with separate processes for each of the target setting and the planning process that goes forward. In order to add value through higher quality decision making, forecasts need to represent the most likely outcome. Therefore, the process of preparing forecasts, often in an evolved environment, must be replaced with something that really focuses on something unbiased. This replaces principles number 9 and 10. When you really think about planning and forecasting, I need to understand where we're going. The target may be a different number from that, but if we don't know where our plans are going to take us, we don't know what additional countermeasures we need to be able to move us where we really want to go. So again, separate plans and forecasts, make them unbiased.
All right. So, quick concept around plans and forecasts from our friends in the Beyond Budgeting community. They've done some amazing work with applying Agile concepts. In fact, they didn't necessarily know anything about Agile. They just realized, as we do, that the budget cycle is really long, it's cumbersome, and really wasteful, if you will. So if you look at ways to fix it, there are 3 ways that I can leave you with, and that is to start dynamic planning. So even if you do a yearly forecast, as mentioned by the gentleman in the video, we want to make sure that we can update it quarterly and look for ways to adjust and inspect and adapt. So we have a larger plan, longer term plan, but we can progressively elaborate that plan and budget as we go along, at least quarterly. And then in order to ensure that we have our standing teams, viable from a financial perspective, we have to make sure that we can pre-fund them, right? And this is not a trivial task because it requires a rethinking and reorganization of the way that we can do planning and budgeting, and get these teams, set up for the longer term. And then perhaps the most important thing is that the third bullet over here is that allocate the money where it's needed and when it's needed. So if I'm able to deliver a release quarterly at least, or maybe even quicker than that, and I'm able to get product success on a more quick basis or more quickly, then I should be able to divert some monies from other releases, other products that are not as financially successful, and take money and move it around. So this is almost sort of an internal VC or venture capital model where I'm able to take money and move it along. And one of the practical ways that we can do this is using what my colleague Bob Payne calls a program alignment wall. So if I have the stories or my backlog or multiple teams laid out, in this case I have let's see, I got 3 customer experience teams, and what I can then do is to take the budget and perhaps do some allocations across those 3 customer experience teams. Maybe $2 million to one, $8 million to another $1 million for some shared services, and then as things go through the refinement process, the discovery, refinement, and delivery process, and I can look at things that are completed, I can measure them in production, then this will allow a more dynamic outlay of finances and monies to this products that are more successful. And also on the flip side, a withdrawal or sort of killing or terminating. If you're going to fail, let's fail fast and remove money from products that are failing in the market or ideas that are failing in the market. So this can be a big visible chart. Many of our clients, we have this as a wall. It's a large wall, and these things are laid out there. And anybody in the organization, whether it's a team member or a program manager or director or even executive walking by, can get a quick snapshot of what's happening. Right? So that's incremental budgeting or agile budgeting and incremental funding. And that's going to take us to the last building block, which is pipeline management. So if I have an organization that has standing teams put in place, extended to customer experience teams, I have engineering in place, I can do some experimentation, test and learn, if you will, using Lean Startup, and then I'm able to solve the financial side of the equation with quarterly budgeting. Then I can start to lay out a portfolio of ideas. Innovation ideas can come from anywhere. So we might have a bunch of ideas bubbling up through our companies. We need some sort of pipeline management, if you will, or demand management, and match it to the capacity of our customer experience teams. So here there's a sample cycle where you might have different ideas coming up from anywhere. By the way, there are modules in many of the Agile tools to help record, capture, and prioritize and manage this process. But even something as simple as a product, product like Lean Kit or version 1, we can lay this out on some sort of product board or idea board, if you will. Maybe an executive council gets together, makes a go, no-go decision on what to move. We prioritize it, we schedule it, and then allocate it to teams. So moving left to right. Our friends at Capital One Labs, there's close to us, a few miles away from where I live here, in Arlington, Virginia, is the innovation lab component of the larger bank. Capital One Bank is a large organization of about 45,000 people, and they have a smaller lab which is about 100 people or so, and they have this is their version, so the source is to give credit where it's due, is from Cap One. This is their process where they are able to explore, incubate, and graduate ideas that then get folded back into the business, and many of these are disruptive ideas. So that's at Cap One Labs. These are our 5 steps in summary: high performance standing teams, engineering, experimentation, incremental funding. I think I have a question for you over here, and then I have a few slides to finish up. So let's, I want to hear from you guys. What is your biggest problem with innovation or disruptive innovation on your Agile team? So let's do a quick poll and then sort of bring this thing together. And I think we're on track to finish up in about 14 minutes from now. Feedback is a problem, and I'm assuming that's a feedback from end customers, end users. Design thinking, absolutely. So there's a movement towards applying design thinking to our product development. Alignment, government, all right. The federal, well, state and federal government, of course, tends to be more bureaucratic than our friends in the private sector. So we certainly need to rethink and be a little more sort of aggressive in the government than we might need to be in the private sector. Business structures, organizational structures, alignment. Yeah, so hopefully I've laid out ideas in each one of these organizations. In each one of these areas, and have given you some ideas on how to move from standard teams, standard Agile teams, Scrum teams, and solve many of these problems. Okay, so perhaps you're wondering, how can I start? So if you are at an executive level, you hear some ideas. There's a video that I have out there. It's called, I did it for it was a keynote at the Agile Development Conference a couple of years ago. You can watch it. It's sort of nice, succinct, if you call it an hour video succinct. You can watch it and get some ideas. There's also some thinking about digital transformation using Agile methods on our website. And then if you're an executive, you might also consider coming and joining us for our Agile Leadership Academy. If you're a program manager, director, PMO lead, here are some thoughts for you. Also some different resources. And if you're a team member, you can come and join us at our training training events, or send your boss to our Agile Leadership Academy, which I mentioned is a one-year program for our executives to go through a transformation. All right. I want to sort of run this video, which will help wrap it all together. Again, this is from Capital One Labs, showed with full permission, how they are able to get some disruptive thinking in place. So I'm going to show this video, and then we'll wrap it up with some more resources and questions. That's the one.
We're about 100 people across 3 offices, and we're a group of makers, entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs who are passionate about changing banking for good.
Capital One Labs is one team of about 100 people. We have a lab here in DC, which is actually located right outside the DC border in Clarendon. We have another lab in San Francisco, and then we have a 3rd lab in New York that's located in Midtown Manhattan.
We're a diverse team bringing a diverse set of experiences and perspectives together to really transform and reinvent the future of money
I had high hopes when I joined Capital One. I wanted to be the digital leader of financial services. But I was like, how much are they really going to deliver on this? And I was blown away.
All the best ideas in the world come when you have designers and engineers and product people and experts at the same table.
We're trying to create this openness and this transparency in banking and really empowering people to make better decisions. There is so much stress associated with your financial life, especially when you're in this paycheck-to-paycheck situation. Anything we can do to make that better for people, to me, is really rewarding.
We work on problems that really matter, that we care about personally, and that we think are core to how Capital One will operate in the future.
We learn something new every single day. Innovation has to happen in some shape or form everywhere in the company. And I'm really interested in technology that we build and that we're developing. We make the developer experience and the designer experience better. I'm very much excited about building stuff and solving problems here that make people's experiences with their financial services providers a heck of a lot better.
We're going to change the way people interact with their money over the next 5 to 10 years. It'll be a fundamentally better and different world.
All right, time for questions.
Great, yeah. So I'll just go down the list here. First question coming in. Interesting point on invalidation. How would you suggest implementing that concept if my team isn't familiar with design thinking?
Well, there are a couple ways you could approach it. One is using design thinking, and that might be a little more complex because design thinking is usually applied directly from a product development perspective. And if you're not doing straight product development, a simpler way to start getting your team familiar with that process is to apply Lean Startup. So you can, of course, go out and buy the book Lean Startup by Eric Ries. There's also an excellent series of books by a gentleman by the name of Ash Maurya. Designing Lean, Running Lean. Running Lean is my favorite. So there's a bunch of books, bunch of videos. Just go to look up Lean Startup and get used to the idea of invalidation. And then, of course, you could always hire a wonderful company to help you with it.
Plug to LitheSpeed. Next question. How would you approach disruptive innovation for a software product that has been in the industry for a decade?
So that's also a great question. This is, it's not only necessary, but it's critical, because one of the things that we end up with anything that has a lock on the market, if you have a larger software product or a software product with a larger market, it tends to lock us in and expose us from what Clayton Christensen calls deadly attacks from below. So we're likely to then get disrupted by a cheaper alternative, maybe that's simpler, because generally with products that have been out there for a while, what we tend to do is to try to make them bigger, charge a little more, and then we keep moving further and further up the value chain. So one of the best ways to do is to kind of look outside, look at the competitive space of the market, and then put yourself in the, minds, this is where design thinking can help with the empathy. Put yourself in the minds of the end user, or hearts and mind of the end user, and see what kind of problems they're having with your particular product or larger product, and then see if there are simpler alternatives that you could then start, maybe create a smaller team, even if it's like a skunkworks type of team, get a smaller team and get them building a product that then disrupts your other product. And then you do it yourself and then retire the larger product safely.
Okay, great. Next question. In my organization, funding and budgets need to be approved yearly, not quarterly. Do you think that there's an extreme disadvantage to this? And if so, how would you suggest combating it?
The answer is yes. That's the bad news, as in it does create a disadvantage. It starts to become a disadvantage when your competitors start to move to a more flexible and adaptive funding cycle. And if we are stuck in a more traditional cycle, it's just like the transition from waterfall to agile. If I'm stuck in an organization that sticks with waterfall delivery and development, while my competitors all move to agile, well, that's going to leave me at an extreme disadvantage. Well, the budgeting cycle is just beginning to make, or the organizations are just beginning to make this move with the funding cycle. So it is a disadvantage, but it's not yet an extreme disadvantage. And the way to get ahead of that curve is to take a look at, again, and look at the wonderful material that's coming out from the Beyond Budgeting cycle community. These are not IT folks, these are finance folks, they're out there preaching to their peers, the CFOs of the world, that the best way to not only save costs, but then also to provide the best amount of funding and flexibility to the product teams is to move to an incremental budgeting cycle. So it is a disadvantage today, and it will become an extreme disadvantage as more and more companies and competitors move to the adaptive funding model. And the way that I can recommend that you move to it is to look at beyond budgeting, start to implement some of those concepts, and convince our business partners in the finance space to make that change as well. Okay, next question. Okay. We have time for a couple more.
Next question. How do you balance the benefits and constraints of co-located versus remote teams in Agile organizations?
All right, that's probably more straightforward questions, the benefits and constraints. So if you go by the canon, as in the Agile canon, the manifesto, we say the best performance comes from teams interacting face to face. And I still believe that's the case, right? So our aspirational goal should be to have our people co-located as much as possible for as long as possible. And I interject that last line because in today's world with many large organizations, whether it's through mergers or acquisitions or any sort of labor arbitrage type strategy, what we might end up with is a fragmentation of teams within different locations, whether it's different cities, different countries, or across the globe. And there again, this is not that as much of a disadvantage as it used to be, and that's simply because of the genesis and evolution of many of the conferencing and collaboration tools. So within our own company, we use a tool called Sococo. And even for a small company, many, if not all of us are scattered across the country, sometimes internationally, and we collaborate regularly. So, for example, Stephanie lives on the East Coast. I live closer in Mid-Atlantic. We have people in Arizona, and we use a tool called Sococo. So, distributed teams, I almost want to say they're the norm. And if you do have a co-located team, then consider yourself extraordinarily blessed and be happy and be very productive. But because of the evolution of teams, because of the evolution of tools like Sococo, like automated build and test, there are many ways to solve and alleviate the problems of being in different locations.
Definitely. Okay, we've got a couple more questions here, but I do want to go ahead and wrap up for those of you who need to hop off. So thank you so much for attending this webinar. Really hope that you guys enjoyed it, you learned something. And be sure to check out the website, LitheSpeed.com, for latest information, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at LitheSpeed for live updates on upcoming webinars, events, and of course our complete training schedule. We will be publishing our webinar calendar for the remainder of this year soon on the LitheSpeed homepage. Again, that's LitheSpeed.com. So check back there often to sign up for those. And if you have any suggestions on what topics you would like to see covered, there is going to be a quick two-question survey that will follow this webinar, and we would love to get your feedback on that. We did just launch year 2 of the Agile Leadership Academy, and we're excited for the second session that is December 11th and 12th. This one's going to focus on the leader's approach to scaling with agility. So a couple of these questions around scaling would definitely be addressed there. And without giving too much away from that, the ALA is kind of the perfect solution for any of these Agile executives to start paving the way for that disruption and really understand that digital transformation with agility. So more details on registration will head your way after this webinar. And Sanjeev would definitely be the pinpoint person to answer any questions that you guys have. On the event side, Agile DC is the area's next biggest conference. So stop by our booth, meet the team. It's October 16th, it's a Monday. We have several speakers this year, including Sanjeev, Roland Cuellar, Raj Ndugala and Mario Silvio will be doing a joint presentation, and Peter Oliver Kruger will do one as well. So if you haven't registered for that, time is running out, but we will send you registration details following this. And if you're interested in digging a little deeper on any of the topics that we covered today, links to the recording and our contact information is coming to you just after we close. And as always, we'll take some additional questions for just a little bit here, so if you'd like to stay and chat with us, we'll be here, and if not, have a fabulous Friday. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Stephanie, and it looks like we got a minute or so if folks have questions.
Yeah. We'll take a couple of other questions here. So next question. I can obviously see how DevOps is essential to continuous integration and therefore rapid innovation, but the teams I've worked with always end up stalling our feedback loop. Is innovation possible without it?
So there's a quote from Donald Rumsfeld that I'll bring in over here. He used to say, "You go to war with the army you have." And over here, I think the basic idea is that just because you don't have DevOps, innovation is absolutely possible. It's just going to be a lot harder. If we think about being as close to production and deploying as rapidly as possible, if you don't have the CICD, the continuous integration, continuous deployment, then what we want to do is to get the next best thing, right? Even if it takes a little bit of a lag, even if it takes time to deploy things, even if the deployment is a little manual in its nature, I would recommend that you absolutely get a handle on automated build and test. Now, the concepts of automated build and test and the implementation of that concept is at least 20 to 25 years old. So I'm pretty sure that even if you don't have DevOps, then you have automated build and test. So if we have automated build and test, then at least we have that sort of baseline on which you can implement a continuous deployment process and technology. So the answer is yes, innovation is possible without CI/CD, but you absolutely need automated build and test.
Okay, great. Next question here. Kanban tool that links both the portfolio directly to the delivery. So version 1 Rally are great at delivery, Lean Kit is great at portfolio, but we want to track progress as stuff moves down from innovation cycle and be able to make decisions on that. Are there any new tools on the horizon?
That is an interesting question. I don't know the answer. I do know that Lean Kit allows board-to-board linkages from left to right. So you can have a process flow. It could be that you might have to move up in licenses from Lean Kit to make that possible. We use Lean Kit ourselves, so I happen to know a little bit more about it. There's innovation again rapidly in this space. Unfortunately, I don't know of any alternatives. My guess is there's at least something out there that should be, that should allow you to be, to do that. But sadly, I don't know the straightforward answer to it. But my sense is Lean Kit, it's going to be possible with Lean Kit.
Okay, great. Next question. How frequent should adaptive budgeting for extremely large organizations work?
Well, we are working with organizations that are in the couple of tens of thousands in size, so somewhere between 20,000 to 40,000. So I don't know what large is in the scale, in your situation. And the thing that we found, the cadence that we found works very well in that space, is an annual budget with quarterly updates. So quarterly updates, even in a fairly large organization.
Okay, great. And last question here. Would you say that you can't be innovative without lean startup methods?
Well, I mean, so every decade brings a flavor and fad of the decade, if you will, right? So the concepts of lean startup are not new. If you look at agile delivery, what we do is just implement a plan, do, check, act cycle, right? So this is the plan, do, check, act cycle from Edwards Deming, from back in the Deming quality loop, and that's in turn was based on Walter Schuert's work at AT&T Bell Labs in the early 1900s. So in that sense, conceptually at least, agile product development is just an application of the scientific method. If you look at lean startup, it's the application of the scientific method or Deming cycle on the business side. We're taking an idea, we have a hypothesis, we test out that hypothesis, we either validate it or invalidate it, we have assumptions, we validate a riskiest assumption, and then we move on to an iterative cycle. So we may not necessarily need to use the very specifics of lean startup, but I would say some sort of iterative testing out of ideas and features and prototypes and designs is necessary. And again, just as with the DevOps question that I answered later, we could certainly, you can find ways to do that more in a more sort of a, what's the word, Band-Aid type way without lean startup. But that said, lean startup itself is not really that difficult to implement. So I would encourage you to look at lean startup and implement it. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I think that wraps up our questions. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us, and we will see you next time. Thanks, Sanjeev.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you for everybody out there for giving us an hour or slightly more of your time, and stay safe and do good work.